When currencies lose credibility, governments reach for something real. In 1519, when Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of Mexico with fewer than 600 men, he wasn't seeking adventure or glory. He was executing a desperate imperial strategy as old as civilization itself. The Spanish Empire, despite appearing magnificent from the outside, was drowning in debt. Their currency was losing credibility across Europe. Italian bankers were demanding higher interest rates. German merchants were questioning Spanish credit. The empire needed something tangible, something that couldn't be printed or promised or negotiated away. They needed gold. What followed wasn't exploration. It was systematic resource extraction, driven by monetary desperation. Within 50 years, Spanish conquistadors had stripped more precious metals from the Americas than had been accumulated in Europe throughout the entire medieval period. Not through trade, not through diplomacy. Through conquest designed specifically to acquire hard assets that could back up a failing financial system. This pattern isn't unique to Spain, it's universal. When empires enter their terminal phase, when their currencies begin losing international acceptance, when their debt becomes unsustainable, they always make the same choice. They stop trying to produce wealth and start trying to seize it. They abandon commerce and embrace plunder. They militarize their resource acquisition because their financial systems can no longer sustain normal economic exchange. We're witnessing this pattern unfold again today. Not through conquistadors seeking gold in distant lands, but through systematic attempts to control the strategic resources that underpin modern civilization. Lithium, rare earth elements, energy reserves, semiconductor materials. The empires are reaching for something real because their currencies are losing credibility, just as they always have, just as they always do. The Spanish Empire in the early 16th century appeared to be at its absolute peak. Their armies were considered invincible. Their territories spanned 3 continents. Their naval power dominated global trade routes. Spanish royal courts were centers of learning and culture. To outside observers, Spain represented the pinnacle of European civilization. But the financial reality told a different story. King Philip II inherited debts that consumed over 300% of annual royal revenues. 300%. The empire was spending 3 times what it collected in legitimate taxation. The gap was filled through borrowing from German banking houses, Italian merchant families, and Dutch financiers. Spain had become a debtor nation disguised as a global superpower. This created impossible mathematics. Military campaigns required immediate funding. Colonial administration demanded constant expenditure. Royal court expenses couldn't be reduced without appearing weak. Infrastructure projects were essential for maintaining control. But revenues from taxation and legitimate trade weren't sufficient to cover even basic operational costs, let alone service existing debts. Spanish currency reflected this unsustainable position. The real, which had once been accepted throughout Europe without question, began requiring verification. Foreign merchants demanded to test silver content before accepting Spanish coins. Italian banks started charging premium interest rates for Spanish loans. German suppliers began demanding payment in gold rather than Spanish currency. The empire faced the choice that every overextended power eventually faces. Reduce spending to sustainable levels, which meant acknowledging limitations and accepting diminished influence, or find external sources of wealth to maintain the illusion of solvency. Spanish leadership chose external acquisition, just as failing empires always choose external acquisition. Cortés understood his mission perfectly. He wasn't exploring new territories for scientific knowledge or cultural exchange. He was extracting maximum wealth in minimum time to address Spanish fiscal crisis. His letters to King Charles I focused obsessively on gold quantities, silver potential, and extraction logistics. The conquest of Mexico wasn't military adventure. It was economic necessity disguised as imperial expansion. The success of Mexican conquest led inevitably to systematic expansion throughout the Americas. Francisco Pizarro's destruction of the Inca Empire, Spanish colonization of silver-rich Peru, the establishment of mining operations across South America, all of it driven by the same desperate need for hard assets that could provide credibility to Spanish currency and enable continued borrowing. For several decades, this strategy appeared to work brilliantly. Spanish galleons returned from the Americas loaded with more gold and silver than Europe had ever seen. Spanish currency became stable again. Italian bankers accepted Spanish loans at reasonable rates. German merchants welcomed Spanish trade. The empire seemed to have solved its financial problems through resource acquisition, but success created new problems that made the underlying crisis worse. Massive influx of precious metals caused severe inflation throughout the Spanish Empire. Prices for basic goods increased faster than wages. Spanish manufacturers became uncompetitive with foreign producers. Traditional industries declined as imported gold and silver distorted the entire economy. More critically, Spanish leadership became addicted to external resource extraction. Instead of using temporary influx of wealth to reform fiscal systems, reduce spending, or build sustainable industries, they increased expenditure and borrowed against future resource extraction. The empire needed ever-increasing quantities of gold and silver to maintain the same level of spending and debt service. By 1600, Spanish America had been strip-mined of easily accessible precious metals. Production costs increased while yields decreased. Transportation became more expensive and dangerous. Native populations had been devastated by disease and overwork. The resource extraction model that had sustained Spanish finances for decades no longer generated sufficient wealth to cover imperial expenses. The empire then made the fatal error that resource-dependent powers always make. They assumed military force could substitute for economic productivity. Spanish armies invaded the Netherlands to seize Dutch commercial wealth. They attacked English shipping to capture maritime resources. They fought France to control European trade routes. Each military campaign consumed enormous resources while generating insufficient returns to justify the expense. Within a generation, Spain had transformed from Europe's dominant power to a declining empire struggling with bankruptcy, territorial losses, and currency collapse. The resource extraction strategy that seemed to offer salvation actually accelerated imperial decline by replacing sustainable economic development with unsustainable plunder. This pattern has repeated throughout history with mathematical precision. When empires enter fiscal crisis, they abandon productive strategies and embrace extractive ones. When their currencies lose credibility, they reach for tangible assets. When their debt becomes unsustainable, they militarize their resource acquisition. And when resource extraction becomes insufficient, they expand military operations until the empire collapses from overextension. The British Empire followed identical logic in its terminal phase. After World War I, Britain faced crushing debt loads and declining industrial competitiveness. The pound sterling, which had been the global reserve currency for over a century, was losing international acceptance. Foreign creditors were demanding gold backing that Britain couldn't provide. The empire needed hard assets to maintain currency credibility. British response focused obsessively on Middle Eastern oil reserves, not for domestic consumption, which was still primarily coal-based, for export revenues that could service imperial debt and support currency stability. Britain carved up Ottoman territories to control petroleum resources. They established protectorates over oil-rich regions. They fought wars specifically to secure energy extraction rights. The pattern intensified during the interwar period as British finances deteriorated further. Currency devaluations in 1931 and 1949 demonstrated pound weakness to global markets. Each devaluation created pressure to acquire more tangible resources that could back up declining currency credibility. British imperial policy became increasingly focused on resource extraction rather than trade development or industrial investment. This strategy failed for the same reasons Spanish resource extraction failed. Military costs of securing and defending resource extraction operations exceeded the economic benefits. Local populations resisted foreign control through guerrilla warfare that consumed enormous resources. Alternative suppliers emerged in regions beyond British control. And most critically, the fundamental fiscal problems that drove resource extraction weren't solved through external asset acquisition. The Soviet Union demonstrated the same pattern during its final decade. Facing mounting economic crisis, currency instability, and unsustainable debt levels, Soviet leadership militarized their resource acquisition strategy. Invasion of Afghanistan was motivated primarily by desire to control Central Asian energy reserves. Military interventions in Africa targeted resource-rich regions. The space program focused obsessively on moon-based mineral extraction possibilities. Each military operation consumed resources that could have been used for economic reform or industrial development. Each intervention generated resistance that required additional military expenditure. Each resource extraction project created dependencies that made the empire more vulnerable to external pressure rather than less vulnerable. Modern American behavior follows this historical template with disturbing precision. Since 2008, when the financial crisis exposed fundamental weaknesses in American fiscal position, resource-focused military operations have accelerated dramatically. Not coincidentally, this acceleration corresponds exactly with the timeline of massive monetary expansion and declining dollar credibility in international markets. Libya in 2011 possessed the largest proven oil reserves in Africa. Syria controls critical pipeline routes between Middle Eastern producers and European markets. Iraq holds the world's second-largest petroleum reserves. Afghanistan contains estimated $3 trillion in rare earth minerals and lithium deposits. Venezuela holds more proven oil reserves than Saudi Arabia. Each military intervention has coincided with resource acquisition opportunities. The pattern becomes obvious when examined systematically. American military operations consistently target regions with strategic resource concentrations. Regions without significant mineral wealth or energy reserves rarely face American intervention, regardless of humanitarian concerns or political considerations. The correlation between resource availability and military attention approaches 100%. This shift represents fundamental change in American grand strategy. During the Cold War, military interventions were primarily ideological, designed to contain communist influence regardless of economic benefits. Modern interventions are primarily economic, designed to secure resource access regardless of ideological considerations. The change reflects declining currency credibility and increasing fiscal pressure. American national debt has increased from $10 trillion in 2008 to over $38 trillion today. Interest payments on this debt now exceed $1 trillion annually. The Federal Reserve has expanded its balance sheet by over $8 trillion through quantitative easing programs. Foreign central banks are reducing dollar reserves and increasing gold holdings. Every indicator suggests declining confidence in American fiscal sustainability. Under these circumstances, American leadership faces the same choice Spanish leadership faced in 1500: accept fiscal reality and reduce imperial commitments to sustainable levels, or militarize resource acquisition to maintain the illusion of solvency through external wealth extraction. Historical precedent suggests which option will be chosen. Recent operations demonstrate increasing sophistication in resource-focused military strategy. Rather than direct territorial conquest, modern approaches emphasize regime change that installs cooperative governments willing to provide favorable resource extraction agreements. This reduces administrative costs while maintaining access to strategic materials. Venezuela provides the clearest example of this evolved strategy. Rather than direct invasion, American policy focused on supporting opposition movements that would provide better resource extraction terms. When political pressure proved insufficient, economic sanctions aimed to destabilize the existing government and create conditions for regime change. When sanctions failed to achieve desired results, direct military intervention became inevitable. The January 2026 operation in Venezuela represents culmination of this strategic evolution. Rapid military action designed to secure immediate control over resource extraction infrastructure. Minimal territorial occupation beyond what's necessary for resource security. Installation of cooperative governance structure willing to provide favorable extraction agreements. The operation demonstrates how modern resource acquisition strategies have been refined through previous interventions. But historical precedent suggests this strategy will fail for the same reasons it always fails. Resource extraction through military force is economically inefficient compared to voluntary economic exchange. Local populations resist foreign control, creating ongoing security expenses that consume extraction profits. Alternative suppliers emerge to fill market demand, reducing the strategic value of controlled resources. More fundamentally, external resource acquisition doesn't solve the internal fiscal problems that motivated military intervention in the first place. American debt continues growing regardless of Venezuelan oil access. Federal Reserve balance sheet expansion continues regardless of Middle Eastern energy control. The underlying mathematics of unsustainable spending and declining currency credibility remain unchanged. This creates the same trap that captured every previous empire that militarized resource acquisition. Initial success generates temporary fiscal relief, encouraging expansion of the strategy. Expansion creates new military commitments that consume increasing resources. Eventually, the cost of maintaining resource extraction operations exceeds the economic benefits, but the empire becomes dependent on continued extraction to service debts incurred during the expansion phase. The end result is predictable because it's been demonstrated repeatedly throughout history. Military overextension, fiscal collapse, currency crisis, imperial disintegration. The resource extraction strategy that seemed to offer salvation actually accelerates decline by replacing sustainable economic development with unsustainable military expenditure. Modern technology doesn't change this fundamental dynamic. Advanced military capabilities make initial resource seizure easier, but they don't reduce the long-term costs of maintaining control over resistant populations. Sophisticated financial instruments make resource extraction profits easier to monetize, but they don't solve the underlying fiscal imbalances that motivated military intervention. The speed of modern communications and transportation means that resistance movements can coordinate more effectively, and alternative suppliers can respond more rapidly to market disruptions. What once required decades for local populations to organize now requires months or even weeks. What once required years for alternative suppliers to develop now requires months. This acceleration means that modern resource extraction strategies face shorter profit windows and higher resistance costs than historical precedents. Spanish conquistadors had decades to extract wealth before organized resistance emerged. Modern interventions face immediate, coordinated, technologically sophisticated opposition from the moment operations begin. The mathematics of modern resource extraction are particularly problematic for American fiscal position. Military operations in resource-rich regions now cost hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Resource extraction profits, even when successful, generate tens of billions in annual revenues. The expense-to-benefit ratio is negative and getting worse as resistance capabilities improve and extraction costs increase. Yet American policy continues to double down on resource acquisition strategy, just as Spanish policy continued expanding American colonization even when extraction costs began exceeding profits. The logic is always the same. The next intervention will be more efficient. The next resource acquisition will generate better returns. The next military operation will solve the underlying problems. History demonstrates conclusively that this logic is always wrong. Resource extraction through military force never solves fiscal crisis. It always makes fiscal crisis worse by adding military expenses to existing fiscal burdens while creating dependencies that make the empire more vulnerable to external pressure. The current acceleration of American resource-focused military operations signals entry into the final phase of imperial decline, the phase where military expenditure consumes increasing percentages of economic output while generating diminishing returns, the phase where currency credibility depends on continued resource extraction rather than productive economic activity, the phase where fiscal sustainability requires constant expansion of military commitments. This phase ends the same way for every empire that enters it: military overextension, fiscal collapse, currency crisis, political disintegration. The specific details vary, but the pattern remains constant across civilizations, centuries, and continents. When currencies lose credibility, governments reach for something real. When they can't find enough real wealth through voluntary exchange, they try to seize it through military force. When military force proves insufficient to generate the wealth needed to sustain the empire collapses from its own internal contradictions. The pattern is absolute. The timeline is accelerating, and the outcome is inevitable, just as it always has been, just as it always will be.